There's a peculiar movie theater in the town where I live, a small place tucked away on a quiet side street. It's a charming old building, its marquee frozen in time. This theater only plays movies from 1987. It's an odd quirk, and nobody in town seems to know how it manages to stay in business. Despite its outdated selection, the theater has a loyal following, and there's rarely a night when it isn't showing something. The strangest part about this theater, however, isn't just its dedication to 1987 films. There's an urban legend that has circulated among the locals for years. The legend claims that if you pay for 3 tickets and buy a large popcorn, they'll play a special film one that shows you your future. The catch? If you manage to watch the entire film, you'll suffer from sleeping problems for the rest of your life. High schoolers, especially, find this legend intriguing. In a small town with limited entertainment options, they often dare each other to test the rumor. Most come back laughing about it, having seen nothing more than old horror flicks or comedies. But there are a few who come back different, quieter, haunted, and plagued by insomnia. Last Friday, my curiosity got the better of me. I've always been a skeptic, brushing off the story as nothing more than a spooky tale to entertain bored teenagers. But something about the theater had always intrigued me, and I decided to see for myself if there was any truth to the legend. I convinced 2 friends to come along, and we made our way to the theater. The cashier, an older man with a weathered face, didn't bat an eye when I asked for 3 tickets and a large popcorn. His expression was neutral, almost indifferent, as he handed over the tickets. We took our seats in the dimly lit theater, the smell of stale popcorn and old fabric filling the air. There were only a handful of other patrons, all engrossed in their own quiet conversations. The lights dimmed and the projector whirred to life. The first few previews were the usual fare trailers for movies that came out decades ago. Then the screen went black and a new film began. The opening scene was eerily familiar. It was my neighborhood, but the details were off. The houses were slightly different, the cars outdated, yet unmistakably our town. I felt a chill run down my spine. As the film progressed, the scenes became more unsettling. They showed moments from my life mundane at first, but then increasingly strange. I saw myself at work, my friends, my family. And then things that hadn't happened yet. Future events, trivial and significant, played out on the screen with disturbing clarity. My friends sat in stunned silence beside me. I glanced at them, and their pale faces mirrored my own unease. The film grew darker, showing events that were deeply personal, things I had never shared with anyone. The final scenes were the worst. They depicted a series of tragic, unsettling events, things I couldn't bear to imagine happening to me or my loved ones. Unable to take it any longer, I stood up abruptly. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice shaking. My friends didn't argue. We stumbled out of the theater, our legs unsteady and hearts pounding. Outside, the cool night air did little to calm my nerves. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the images from the film replayed in my mind. The next day, my friends and I met to discuss what we had seen. Each of us had witnessed different futures, but the experience had left us all deeply disturbed. We tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was some elaborate prank, or perhaps the theater had some advanced technology that tapped into our subconscious fears. But deep down, we knew there was no logical explanation that could fully account for what we had seen. In the following weeks, we heard stories from other locals who had dared to test the legend. Some laughed it off, claiming they had seen nothing unusual. But others, like us, were haunted by what they had witnessed. The shared experience created a bond among us, an unspoken understanding of the theater's dark secret. Months later, I still struggle with sleep. Every night, I lie awake, fearing the images that will invade my dreams. The theater remains open, its 1987 films continuing to draw in curious visitors. But I can't bring myself to go back. The memory of that night is too vivid, too chilling. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, there's something undeniably strange about that theater. It's a place where the past and future intertwine and reality blurs with fiction. If you ever find yourself in my town and feel tempted to test the legend, I urge you to think twice. Some mysteries are better left unexplored, and some experiences can never be forgotten. Update: it's been a few weeks since my last post, and I've been hesitant to share what's been happening since. The events that unfolded after our visit to the theater have taken a darker, more unsettling turn, and I'm starting to question my own sanity. After our initial visit, my friends and I tried to move on with our lives. We avoided discussing the theater, hoping the memories would fade, but the opposite happened. The more we tried to forget, the more vivid and disturbing the memories became. It started with the dreams. Each night, I'd fall into a restless sleep, only to be haunted by nightmares that mirrored the scenes from the film we saw. The images were so clear, so real, that I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I was still in the theater. My friends reported the same experiences, dreams that felt less like dreams and more like glimpses into a dark, unavoidable future. A few days ago, I decided to drive by the theater, hoping to convince myself it was just an old building with no real power over us. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The marquee, which usually displayed the titles of the 1987 films, was blank. The lights were on, but there was no indication of what was playing. I felt a chill run down my spine, but forced myself to keep going. That night, I received a call from one of my friends, Sarah. She was frantic, her voice shaking. She told me she had seen someone following her for the past few days, a tall man in a dark coat who always seemed to be just out of sight. At first, she thought it was a coincidence, but then she saw him standing outside her house, staring up at her window. When she called the police, they found no trace of him. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was probably just a trick of the light or her imagination playing tricks on her. But then I started noticing strange things too. Objects in my house would be moved, lights would flicker, and I'd hear faint whispers late at night when I was alone. At first, I brushed it off as stress, but the occurrences became too frequent to ignore. Mark, the third friend who went to the theater with us, called me in the middle of the night, saying he'd seen the same tall man standing at the end of his driveway. He tried to approach him, but the man disappeared into the shadows. Mark's voice was filled with fear, something I'd never heard from him before. Desperate for answers, the three of us met to discuss what was happening. We shared our experiences, each story more unsettling than the last. The common thread was the presence of this tall man and the feeling of being watched. We decided to visit the theater one last time, hoping to confront whatever it was that had attached itself to us. When we arrived, the theater looked different. The marquee was still blank and the windows were dark. We hesitated at the entrance, a sense of dread washing over us. Gathering our courage, we stepped inside. The lobby was empty, eerily silent, with no sign of the usual staff or patrons. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. We made our way to the main theater, the doors creaking as we pushed them open. The room was empty, but the projector was on, casting flickering shadows on the screen. As we approached, the film started playing on its own. This time, it showed scenes we didn't recognize, dark, twisted images that made no sense but filled us with an overwhelming sense of terror. Then, the film changed. It showed the three of us standing in the theater watching the screen. But behind us, in the shadows, was the tall man. We spun around, but there was no one there. The temperature dropped, and we could see our breath in the cold air. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Panicked, we ran from the theater, not daring to look back. We drove in silence, the gravity of what we'd experienced settling in. Since that night, the disturbances have only intensified. The tall man has been seen by each of us, always lurking just out of reach. The dreams have become more vivid, almost prophetic in nature. We don't know what to do or how to stop it. The theater seems to have a hold on us, its dark influence extending far beyond its walls. We're scared, exhausted, and desperate for a solution. If anyone has any advice or has experienced something similar, please let us know. We need help and we're running out of time. Final update: it's been a month since my last update and things have reached a breaking point. This will be my final post, as I'm no longer sure if sharing this will help or if it will only draw more attention to whatever malevolent force we've encountered. After our last visit to the theater, the situation spiraled out of control. The strange occurrences became a constant presence in our lives. The tall man appeared more frequently, and his proximity grew closer with each sighting. The sense of being watched intensified, and the whispers became a relentless background noise that invaded our waking hours and our dreams. The worst part was the dreams. They became indistinguishable from reality, vivid and terrifying. Each of us dreamt of the theater, the tall man, and increasingly darker events. The dreams weren't just nightmares, they felt like premonitions, showing us a future filled with dread and despair. Mark was the first to crack. He stopped sleeping altogether, too afraid of what he might see. His health deteriorated rapidly, and he became a shell of his former self. One night, he called me in a state of panic, saying the tall man was inside his house. I rushed over, but by the time I arrived, Mark was gone. His house was empty, with no sign of a struggle. The police launched a search, but they found no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Sarah and I were terrified. We decided to leave town, hoping distance would break whatever curse the theater had placed on us. We packed our bags and left in the middle of the night, driving for hours without a destination in mind. But no matter how far we went, the feeling of being watched remained. In a small motel room far from home, we tried to make sense of it all. Sarah was convinced the theater was some sort of portal, a place where the boundaries between realities were thin. I was more skeptical, still clinging to the hope that there was a rational explanation. But then, something happened that shattered my skepticism. We had fallen asleep, exhausted from the constant fear. I woke up to the sound of the motel room door creaking open. In the dim light, I saw the tall man standing in the doorway, his eyes glowing faintly. Paralyzed with fear, I couldn't move or speak. He stepped inside, his presence overwhelming the room. Sarah woke up and screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the whispers that filled the air. The next thing I remember is waking up alone in the room. Sarah was gone, her belongings left behind. I searched for her, but there was no sign she had ever been there. Desperate and terrified, I realized I had to confront the theater one last time. I returned to town, the theater standing ominously in the twilight. The marquee was still blank, and the building seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Summoning all my courage, I stepped inside. The lobby was empty, just as it had been before. I made my way to the main theater, the silence pressing in on me. The projector flickered to life as I entered, showing scenes of my life on the screen. I saw myself, Mark, and Sarah, our faces twisted in fear. Then, the screen went dark, and a new film began. It showed a version of me I didn't recognize, haggard, haunted, consumed by the darkness that had followed us. And then, I saw the tall man. He was closer than ever, his eyes boring into mine. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned around, but no one was there. The fear was overwhelming, but I forced myself to watch, hoping for some understanding. The final scene showed the theater itself, empty and decaying. The camera panned to the seats, where I saw the figures of my friends, their faces blank and eyes hollow. The film ended and the screen went dark. The silence was absolute, and I realized the whispers had stopped. I left the theater, the cold night air a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere inside. The town was eerily quiet, and I felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. Whatever had happened in that theater had marked me, and I knew I could never escape it. I've decided to leave town for good. I'm not sure where I'll go, but I can't stay here any longer. The memories are too painful and the fear too real. If you ever find yourself in my town, I urge you to avoid the theater at all costs. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some experiences can haunt you forever. Thank you to everyone who followed our story and offered support. I hope that by sharing this, I can prevent others from making the same mistake. Stay safe and trust your instincts. Some mysteries are better left unsolved.